Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, my friend from Caroni Central, whilst well-intentioned, did get into a bit of misleading. The first thing I'd like to start off by saying is by the mere reading of the title of the bill, one can immediately come to the correct conclusion that these are amendments that are being imposed on us, because it is called the Miscellaneous Provisions FATF Compliance Bill. So by definition, what we're here today to do is to fulfill obligations that are being imposed on us by this international regulatory body called FATF. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Because as my friend from Caroni Central quite rightly pointed out, we in Trinidad and Tobago would run the risk of losing correspondent banking, which means that we can no longer have transactions, banking transactions internationally, if we don't follow what is being requested by this body called FATF. And then there's another body called Global Forum, that is the EU equivalent. But here today, what we're dealing with is FATF compliance. I'd also like to correct the record to say we will pass this today, tonight, and in months to come, the government, or whoever is the government at the time, will come back to Parliament with proposed amendments. Because the truth is, in combating what we're seeking to combat here, which is corruption, transnational crime, and also anti-terrorism terrorism financing in an anti-terrorism manner, the goalposts are always shifting. Because the truth is, the criminals do not pause in their tracks. So every time you plug holes with legislation internationally and globally, there will be changes. So to stand here today by anyone on the other side to try and sell to the population that it is what we're here today is doing something that could have or should have been done in the last 9 years is completely false. I'd also like to say that slipped into this Miscellaneous Provisions Act are other pieces of legislation, amendments to pieces of legislation. There are 13 acts we're being asked to amend here today. Very importantly, the Trustees Ordinance, the Prevention of Corruption Act, known as POCA, the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is POCA, the Prevention of Corruption Act, the Anti-terrorism Act, the Police Service Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago, the FIUTT Act, the Income Tax Act, Companies Act, Partnership Act, Registration of Business Names Act, the Securities Act, and the Non-Profit Organizations Act. And I'd like to start at the outset by saying the opposition will support legislation that protects the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. We'll always do that. But it is our duty, and I take the duty personally very, very seriously as a representative for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, that if we spot there are areas that there can be tweaks, there can be amendments, there can be improvements, it is our duty to point that out to the government. They can choose to do it as they will and as they may. It is also our duty that if we see that there are potential infringements on citizens' constitutional rights, we must enter the debate and put forward our concerns on behalf of those we represent to ensure better legislation. And I could say at the outset, a bill like this that is 120 pages long or 101 pages long, there will be errors. I take you immediately, Mr. Speaker, to Clause 5. Clause 5 reads, the mutual assistance in criminal matters is amended. Obviously missing from there is the word act. It should read the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act is amended. It can't be the criminal mutual assistance in criminal matters is amended. And it is our duty, wanting the best legislation for Trinidad, to point these simple things out. We've heard about amendments that will be proposed by the Honourable Member for Viceabad. We haven't seen them as yet. We await them. But there are certain provisions in here that it is our duty to raise specific concerns about. And it is not in objection to the purpose of the Act or in objection to the purpose of the amendments. I can start immediately by saying, I congratulate the members, the government, and those who drafted this for bringing specific provisions that I am sure are not in compliance with FATF. They have introduced in this Miscellaneous Act bill certain provisions that finally allow immunity for law enforcement officers who are in covert and undercover operations. And that is something that will move us forward because it is absolutely necessary. I'm sure the member for Tunapuna would have appreciated those types of legislative protections as a police officer. Because up to this point, the only protection police officers had, and law enforcement officers who were operating in undercover operations or passing illegal goods with criminals, was the hope that the DPP would offer no criminal charge against them. So today, I could say at the outset, this legislation that introduces that, for example, if we go straight to the section that deals with the amendment to the Police Service Act, Clause 5, something called controlled deliveries. I am sure that was not a FATF compliance issue. But what it does is it improves the law of Trinidad and Tobago, and that is something the opposition can and will support. That evidence obtained as a result of the conduct of controlled delivery on undercover operation is admissible in a court of law. Because before there was this lacuna in the law that put police officers and law enforcement officers at risk of criminal charge if they were in undercover operations, for example, transacting in illegal firearms or illegal drugs. They ran the risk of being charged, and the way it was being dealt with prior is to get the approval of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution not to prosecute them for that. So that is good law. It does not mean that there are not other areas that we will endeavor to assist and to point out that need to be looked at very, very carefully. For example, dealing with the trustees' ordinance and the proposed amendments. These are good, because what it is doing is a recognition globally that the use of trusts are sometimes abused and false trusts are set up, and they're trying to get behind that. So to stand here today by those on the other side and to say, oh, that wasn't done before, we have been seeing the introduction. This government had introduced the registration of beneficial ownership to be companies' registry. That was the plugging of that hole. But what we're seeing here today is they found other loopholes that need to be plugged. So I start by saying, or I say now, that these proposed 13 separate amendments are 13 separate pieces of legislation. Many of the proposals are admirable and appear to be aimed at targeting, Mr. Speaker, corruption, terrorist and criminal enterprises. And we have no objection to policies and good legislation with such objectives. That is the combating of corruption, terrorist financing, and criminal enterprises. But as lawyers, we always know the devil is in the detail. So if we go now to the first bill, the Miscellaneous Provisions FATF Compliance Bill 2025, the first concern that I have, Mr. Speaker, is where we are amending the trustees' ordinance at Clause 3, C, and you're saying at C3, C2, you're now inserting a new subclause 5 and 6 and talking about competent authorities and saying it will have the meaning assigned it under a new section 57A 1B of POCA, the Proceeds of Crime Act. And you need to go now to section clause 6, and you look at what is going to be this new definition of competent authorities. And I have a concern, and the concern is we are now broadening it to this undefined body called public authorities. Who are public authorities? Could it simply be a ministry setting up a department that they say the functions of that department are for investigating or prosecuting money laundering with no oversight? Is this not something that we should define a little tighter? Is it not something that if these public authorities already exist, we should not list? Because what you're doing is you're giving them very, very broad powers that can infringe on any citizen's rights without oversight. You then go, Mr. Speaker, to the Prevention of Corruption Act. And again, I was pleased to see that we're introducing the concept and the definition of embezzling. So we're now saying at clause 4A that we're going to amend the Prevention of Corruption Act, and any practitioner knows how bare bones that particular act is. And now we're saying that the embezzling, to embezzle means the stealing of money by a person who is responsible for such money, or money that belongs to the employer of that person. Again, an excellent addition, because we know that takes place, and unfortunately too often it may take place in the public service, but it is not limited to the public service alone. And then we get into what was referred to earlier by the member for Barataria Sawa, the foreign public officials, and these particular new insertions into the Prevention of Corruption Act of 5A and 5B. Unfortunately, it was watered down, respectfully, the submission, because it was used for political purposes, and to go down certain lines and to talk about a Tobagonian who has been targeted by those on the other side and by the former Prime Minister, and to mix and muddle an important debate like this today. And quite rightly, the member for Port of Spain South pointed out in this tit-for-tat manner that while you want to talk about that, why don't you talk about EMBD? Why don't you talk about Eden Gardens, etc.? These, unfortunately, don't have retroactivity. But what we're seeing introduced here now are important additions to the Prevention of Corruption Act. It is good language, it is good intentions, but I submit at this stage the language needs defining. When you look at, Mr. Speaker, clause 4 and what is being proposed at clause 4B, and in particular the new 5A to the Prevention of Corruption Act, we're saying a person who is a public official commits an offense under this act where he deprives the state of revenue to which it is entitled. And that is where the member for Barataria Sawa sought to put in certain examples according to him. But this needs further definition. What do you mean by deprives the state of revenue to which it is entitled? I could see when you get into a court of law that becoming a huge dispute and a back and forth by a defense. These are the things we need to tighten up respectfully. It goes on to talk about soliciting gifts from foreign officials. Again, I am glad that we're now introducing the bribery of foreign public officials, because we know that it can happen. Embezzlement or misappropriation of other diversion of property, funds, or security. A person, this is 5D, a person holding a public office shall not intentionally embezzle, misappropriate, or otherwise divert for his benefit or the benefit of another person or entity any property, public or private fund or securities, or any other thing of value entrusted. That is an excellent insertion, Because what it does now is put criminal sanction on persons who breach the public's trust when they're put into positions of authority in public life. We then go to the next clause 5, which is where I pointed out a short while ago there's a missing word, and the act. Act is missing. And this is all about mutual assistance in criminal matters. Mr. Speaker, mutual assistance in criminal matters is a critical component in the fight against corruption, and especially transnational corruption. But I use this opportunity now to register a serious concern. And that serious concern is specifically in relation to a mutual assistance matter, or a matter that deals with us in a foreign jurisdiction, and a crime or crimes that they claim were being committed by one of our citizens, and they requested an extradition. And after, it was the Prime Minister, the Honourable Member for Siparia, then Prime Minister in June 2015, who stood up.
About that. As we know, hang on a bit, as we know, the matter is before the learned judge for decision. Submissions have been made, the matter is before the learned judge for decision. You could speak euphemistically about it, but I think you should tread carefully with it on that. Because simply the matter has been adjourned for decision. That's all I'm going to tell you. You are skillful enough to wade your way around it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I smile because we know that matters that may be awaiting decision may be curtailed way before the decision comes. So, Mr. Speaker, I use this opportunity to register concern that when requests are made under legislation like the one we're being asked to amend here, by foreign governments, that should be taken very seriously. And we must not allow it to be swept under the carpet or swept out the door. We move on now to one of the meatiest pieces of amendments, certainly in terms of the number of clauses being proposed to be amended in the Proceeds of Crime Act. And I see that we're seeking to delete the definition of drug trafficking and drug trafficking offense, because now what we're doing under that act, if you go to E, 6A1E, you're seeing that now we're going with this broad definition of criminal conduct. And we're saying criminal conduct which constitutes an offense in Trinidad and Tobago or occurs outside of Trinidad and Tobago, and would constitute an offense if it occurred in Trinidad and Tobago. So that catches all. Again, a good amendment. But I want to point out why it is the opposition has to intervene. So you look at that, and what it is saying is you're getting rid, and when you go through this part of the legislation, you're seeing the deletion of all references to drug trafficking and drug trafficking offenses. But then you go to 6C, which is on page 13, and they say we're repealing subsection 4.1 and substituting a new subsection 4.1. And you see the new substitution says, if the court determines that the defendant has benefited from the commission of a specified offense that is not a drug trafficking criminal conduct. So again, an obvious deletion, because we're seeking to remove that, but here you're inserting it in the new section 4, subsection 1. So these are some of the things that need to be addressed. But let us go back now. The whole of this part of Clause 6 is all dealing about where a person is convicted of criminal conduct and proceedings in magistrates' court or in the High Court, and is now establishing a process where after conviction and sentence, you can have confiscation orders. it would be useful to know, and hopefully a speaker coming after, or maybe the member for Faizabad in his wrap-up, would tell us, because I have often wondered how many confiscation orders have been made. Because again, it is a useful provision. The only way we will ever be able to seriously combat criminality is by taking the money away from the criminals. So you're convicted, seize their assets. It is not being utilized enough. And I will use this point to put on record that when the last government put in place follow your money legislation or explain your wealth, it was certain persons assisted by those on the other side who challenged that through the courts. And these are the important provisions in law that allow law enforcement to seriously take a bite out of crime and criminality. So these proposed amendments, Mr. Speaker, appear to deal with confiscation of proceeds of crime via confiscation orders. And we will support the government in ensuring, if we can, that those orders are utilized more. But let us move now to the new proposed Section 32. So you go to N in Section 32, repealing subsection 1, substituting the following subsection. And this is an area of concern for us. You're now seeking to put in place a new Section 32(1) to read, a police officer may, for the purposes of an investigation in or outside of Trinidad and Tobago, into A, criminal conduct, B, whether a person has benefited from criminal conduct, C, the extent or whereabouts of the proceeds of criminal conduct, or D, a cash seizure, apply to a judge for an order under subsection 2 in relation to particular material or material of a particular description. We have to have proper safeguards in place to prevent abuse. Because we've seen all too often where provisions such as this have been utilized in an abusive manner and infringe the constitutional rights of our citizens. You turn the page now, dealing with criminal property. And I say this is a good principle, is making it an offense to enter into an arrangement to retain or control a person's proceeds of criminal conduct. I look forward to this provision being applied, because all too often there are persons who are hiding the fruits of criminals for them. And now what we're doing is we're introducing that is going to be a specific criminal offense. And again, you'll see here in the Proceeds of Crime Act in poker, the new introduction of a Section 50A for undercover operations. I'm sure that wasn't on the basis of a FATF recommendation, but it is absolutely necessary. So, Mr. Speaker, those are some of the benefits of the legislation as well as some of the concerns. Then we go to the Anti-Terrorism Act. Clause 7 deals all with the Anti-Terrorism Act. And again, admirable. This one, I feel certain, some of it would have been to make us FATF compliant. But I was quite surprised to see that for the first time now we're going to have, in Trinidad and Tobago, it appears, specific offenses for hijacking planes. So again, maybe it's a FATF requirement, or maybe in looking at anti-terrorism law, maybe it was in the pipeline before, but again, those are things that we can support. Threatening and intimidating a person to seize an aircraft, the offense of hostage taking, the offense of hijacking a plane. No one in their right mind, and certainly no one on this side, could object to such provisions. And then you go again, this is under this particular Anti-Terrorism Act, and you see the insertion of a new 24D, which is undercover operations. And again, I have to highlight it because it is good. So, Mr. Speaker, we then go to the Income Tax Act. That's the next area I'd like to direct attention to. the provisions that are being suggested, the amendments to the Income Tax Act. That's found at Clause 10, and the introduction of a new 97A. And this is where I have concerns. Because what it is doing is it's giving the board investigative powers, which I agree it should have. But then when you look at the new proposed B and C to 97A, it says that the board shall have the authority to investigate any offences under this act or any other offences that comes to its attention, and in the exercise of such authority. First of all, how are we adding in, or why are we adding in, or any other offence that comes to its attention? So is it now that anyone can walk into the Board of Inland Revenue and tell an officer at the Board of Inland Revenue that this person has drugs or has guns, and the Board of Inland Revenue is now charged with the authority and the jurisdiction to go and investigate that? We need to define it very, very carefully. It should only be related to offences under the BIR Act or other taxation-related offences. We cannot have it as broad as it is being proposed, because it is then giving the authority, meaning the Board of Inland Revenue, the ability and the authority to require any person to produce and make available for inspection and examination any books, records, documents, or other material that the board considers relevant to the investigation. That should be limited alone to matters of taxation, and to engage and cooperate with law enforcement agencies or other. So the point being made there is, whilst you broaden the powers, make sure that it is restricted to the parameters of this statutory body. As we all know as practitioners of law, the statutory body cannot drift beyond the parameters of the statute to which it finds its genesis. So we need to tighten that up. And of course, dealing with the nominee directors, and again, the member for Barataria Sawa can resist the opportunity to get on this political soapbox. Helping me. Just to deal with a couple points raised. So, Mr. Speaker, we on this side will support Trinidad and Tobago being FATF compliant. We have absolutely no desire to stand in the way and to put us at risk of not having correspondent banking. In fact, I personally made 2 trips to the US Congress, along with other leaders from the CARICOM, to make the submission to them. And that is why what the member for Port of Spain South was saying about sovereignty is a real point. Too often it is persons sitting in rooms far away who may not even be able to identify on a globe where Trinidad and Tobago is, making these demands of us, not understanding how different we are to their perception, but how it would affect us. And that is why we have to ensure that in the implementation in domestic legislation, we don't just take their pills wholesale, and we ensure that it achieves the policy and the purpose of what is required, i.e. the fighting of corruption, the fighting of terrorism, the fighting of transnational organized crime, but ensuring that our rights as citizens are not trampled. And that was the point that we were making to the US Congress and the financial body that was there with oversight, that don't just pass these pieces of legislation and destroy correspondent banking in the CARICOM region, because we are not. For example, Trinidad, there's nothing about Trinidad that is a tax haven. So persons sitting, whether it be in Brussels or elsewhere. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I won't use the full time, but thank you. So we will agree with what will assist in keeping correspondent banking. The goalposts are going to be continuously moving, and there will be new legislation that will be proposed in the future. This whole debate about what was submitted on August 15th, our understanding on this part is, yes, the government submitted a questionnaire on August 15th, but specific parts were left out, and in particular, what is being referred to by us on this side is we were required to pass legislation by that date of August 15th, and obviously that was missed. But as the member for Port of Spain South said, deadlines are missed. We are prepared to work with the government. You can't do it at a committee stage. You can't do it by just looking at a bill of 101 pages and ensure that everything is correct. Send it to a joint select committee. We will work with you assiduously to get it done. If you choose not to, because you have the majority, so be it as well. But we would have done our part on this side. So that is what we say was missing on August 15th. So, Mr. Speaker, the next bill on proliferation, I don't think much needs to be said about that. The member for Port of Spain South made certain submissions on it, and he may raise those at committee stage if he deems fit. We are not standing in the way of passage of good legislation, in particular legislation that will protect Trinidad and Tobago and its citizens, but it is our duty to draw the line and to say where we believe rights may be trampled and there can be tighter provisions in the legislation. With those words, I thank you, Mr. Speaker.